Well, hello and welcome to episode 16 of Year with Jesus. As you may know, soon after Jesus began his public ministry, he had a group of people who followed him. These are designated as disciples. The term means learner or student, and in keeping with the Jewish tradition, they often referred to Jesus as their rabbi or teacher. And we have descriptions of some of the disciples being specifically called by Jesus to follow him. Others, it seems, just simply wanted to follow along and became part of that group. And there was more than 12. We read in the Gospels that Jesus sent out 70 of them to preach and heal. So there was at least 70. And then after Jesus' resurrection, there was a core group numbering 120. But then a subgroup of this broader group of disciples were called by Jesus to be apostles, which means sent ones or messengers. And there was 12 of them. Now, sometimes when the Gospels use this term disciples, it is referring to this subgroup of 12 apostles. And at other times, the word disciples is referring to the larger group, and it's hard to know sometimes which group is meant. Then there were the crowds who followed Jesus from place to place. But he wasn't their rabbi. They were there for the popcorn. They liked what they saw him do. They were the recipients of his miracles and healing. And then there's another key group called the Pharisees, who were members of a religious sect within Judaism who controlled local synagogue life. They had a lot of influence over the people and are often seen on the sidelines of Jesus' ministry, criticising and harassing Jesus. They were in a bit of a bind because they could see how popular Jesus was among the people. So we have the inner group, the 12. We have a broader group of disciples, numbering at least 70. We have the crowds, numbering thousands, and the knockers on the sidelines, the Pharisees, who pop up in small numbers wherever Jesus went. Now, how the 12 became the 12 is recorded in several gospel passages. We are given detail of the calling of 6 in particular: Simon Peter, his brother Andrew, both fishermen; Philip, who was from the same town as Peter and Andrew, Bethsaida; James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were Simon Peter's business partners; and Matthew, who was a tax collector. Let's read one of the gospel accounts regarding the calling of several of the disciples. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Now, this wasn't the first time that Peter had been introduced to Jesus. He had been introduced to him by his brother Andrew, who had previously been a disciple of John the Baptist. So Peter meets Jesus at the baptism site on the Jordan River. Let's read about that. The next day, John was there again with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 p.m. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the 2 who heard what Jesus had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah," that is, the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." "Nazareth? Can anything good come from there?" Nathanael asked. "Come and see," said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Then sometime later, from this broader group of disciples, Jesus calls 12 of these disciples as apostles. And incidentally, Nathanael, who we've just read about, is not chosen as one of the 12. One of those days, Jesus went to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples, that's the larger group of disciples, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, who we named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. The inner group of 12 apostles were all men, but the broader group of disciples were a mix of men and women. And culturally, it would have been entirely inappropriate for a rabbi's inner group to include women. But clearly, among the 70, there were women who were very close to Jesus and were very influential among the group and in the life of the early church. Now, I want to finish up with 2 brief thoughts about being a disciple. The first is, it's impossible to think of the church as church without properly addressing the need to grow a community of disciples. I've rarely had God speak specifically to me, but one time I'll never forget. I was camping in a tent in a little town called Marla in South Australia in 1989 when God spoke these words to me during the night. He said, "You don't grow a church from the outside in, but from the inside out. The house church is the basis for growth, and the key to growth is faith." Now, whether it meets in a house or not, it's not the point. The point is that through these small disciple-making groups, it's through them that God builds his church. And that's what Jesus did. He gathered 12. And then beyond that, 70. And beyond that, 120. But he devoted most of his attention to the 12. It seems that they were with him for most of the time during those 3.5 years of ministry. And it was pretty intense. Jesus needed time out from them and would withdraw regularly to pray alone to his Father, but he would involve them in the miracles. They would be there during the teaching times, and they would share meals with him. They would witness his encounters with others. They would assist in his practical needs. They would have times of retreat and debrief regularly with him. Churches today that try to build a following using crowd strategy will always have an issue making disciples. People like to be entertained, but only disciples understand what they have received must be passed on to others who can also pass it on to others. And it's the sharing of life, not weekly meetings. And it's in that context that disciples are formed. I'm not saying larger weekly meetings are wrong, but that the emphasis on them at the expense of disciple making is not consistent with the pattern of Jesus. My second thought about being a disciple is this. One of the misconceptions of being a disciple of Jesus is that you must first be really committed. But you might just begin the journey not being committed, but by being intrigued. We see this among Jesus' disciples in the Gospels. They are at various stages of belief and unbelief. They are at various stages of understanding and not having a clue. They are at various stages of personal commitment, but they were all disciples. So remember, the word disciple means learner. And if you are participating in this year with Jesus and you are learning from Jesus, you are a disciple of Jesus. And as you learn more, you may or may not decide to believe and dedicate your life to him, but you are interested to follow along and learn as you go. Congratulations, you're a disciple. Becoming a believer is a process, but it starts with becoming a learning disciple. God bless and see you in the next episode.